The morning of my brother's funeral rose with a heaviness that seemed to seep out of the very soil, as though the world itself recognized the absence of a man whose quiet presence had always steadied the spaces he occupied. The sky was a swollen canvas of muted gray, the kind that presses low and suffocates the horizon, blurring the line between earth and heaven until everything feels suspended in a hush just before a storm. I remember stepping out of the car and feeling a chill kiss the back of my neck, the kind of cold that isn't just temperature but a reminder of mortality creeping through seams you didn't know existed. People milled around the church entrance like slow-moving shadows, their black attire blending with the dim morning light, their murmurs folding into a somber hum that seemed disconnected from me, as though I were watching a scene through thick glass instead of living in it. Inside the church, the scent of old wood and wilting flowers hovered in the air, heavy enough to settle into my lungs. My brother's portrait stood at the front, his smile frozen in that familiar, almost mischievous half-grin that always made people feel like they were let in on a secret. It hit me harder than the casket did. The casket felt final, yes, but the portrait felt intimate, like a memory trying to breathe again, but trapped behind a glossy frame. My wife walked beside me in silence, her hand lightly touching my elbow, a gesture that should have comforted me but instead felt strangely hollow, as though the warmth behind it was rehearsed rather than instinctive. Maybe it was grief muddling my perception. Maybe it was exhaustion stretching everything thin. But from the moment we entered the aisle, something felt off, a quiet unease threading itself beneath my ribs. The service passed in waves, some moments washing over me so quickly I barely felt them, others slamming into me with a force that made my breath stutter. People stood one by one, offering memories of my brother, stories of his kindness, his stubborn determination, his unwavering loyalty, his ridiculous ability to fix anything using tools that should never have been capable of the task. They talked about his cabin, the one he built with his own calloused hands on the ridge overlooking the lake, where we spent entire summers as boys, barefoot and wild, where he later brought his children to teach them how to fish, how to build a fire, how to listen to the forest without interrupting its ancient rhythm. The cabin wasn't just a building, it was a living chapter of our childhood, a sanctuary that breathed with the whispers of every memory we ever tucked into its corners. Hearing it mentioned now felt like pressing on a bruise, painful, but somehow necessary. I drifted through the motions of grief, nodding as people passed by offering condolences that blurred together like a script spoken thousands of times. I appreciated them, truly, but each phrase felt like a distant echo bouncing off the cavern that grief had hollowed inside me. My niece and nephew clung to each other in the front row, their eyes red, their faces too young to bear expressions that heavy. Watching them made something inside me twist, a tightening that felt protective and aching all at once. They had already lost so much. They didn't even know how much more they were in danger of losing. After the service ended, people broke into small conversations, little clusters of sorrow drifting around the room. I stepped a few feet away just to steady myself, inhaling deeply, hoping for even a fragment of clarity in the fog that clouded my thoughts. But before I could gather enough air to feel grounded, my wife leaned in close, her voice slicing through the quiet with a precision that felt almost unreal. "Let's sell his cabin before his kids find out," she whispered, as casually as if she were commenting on the refreshments being served in the next room. For a moment, I honestly believed I had misheard her. Grief messes with your senses. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the universe distorted her words. But when I turned to look at her, the truth slapped me harder than any spoken confirmation could have. Her eyes held no grief, no hesitation, no reverence for the moment. Instead, I saw calculation, an almost clinical focus working behind the soft expression she wore for appearances. She wasn't thinking about memories or legacy or the children standing only yards away. She was thinking about opportunity, about profit, about striking quickly before anyone else could claim what she had already begun mentally dividing into dollar signs and paperwork. The world didn't just blur, it spun. A sickening twist of disbelief and anger surged through me, crashing into the raw ache of loss until my chest felt unbearably tight. The funeral around us became a distant echo, the murmuring voices, the clinking of teacups, the rustle of dresses and coats, all of it fading beneath the thunderous pounding of my own heartbeat. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman I married with the stranger who had just turned my brother's legacy into an opportunistic scheme. How could she say something like that here, now, at the precise moment when respect and compassion should be at their peak? How could she look at that cabin, the soul of our childhood, the place where my brother's laughter still lived in the walls, and see only a quick sale waiting to happen? As she continued speaking, outlining her reasoning with ruthless efficiency, something inside me cracked in a way I knew couldn't be undone. She talked about market value, about how the property would fetch a high price in the current climate, about how his children were minors and wouldn't understand the complexities of estate distribution anyway. Every word drove another nail into the widening fissure between us, revealing layers of her I had either ignored or never recognized. Her tone was practical, detached, utterly out of sync with the grief-laden air around us. And with every sentence, I felt myself drifting further away from her, not just emotionally, but morally, as though we now lived on opposite sides of some vast chasm carved open by loss. I looked again toward my niece and nephew. They were wiping their eyes, their expressions etched with the unmistakable confusion of children trying to understand a world that had suddenly taken something essential from them. And that was when the shift happened, the moment that felt like something inside me. The oldest part, the part shaped by every summer at that cabin, every memory of my brother shielding me, guiding me, loving me, rose like a tide and anchored itself in a single, unwavering truth. I would not betray them. I would not betray him. Not for money, not for convenience, not for anyone. She kept talking, oblivious to the internal earthquake ripping through me. But her words no longer held power. They drifted around me like smoke, thin, poisonous, easy to dispel with a single breath of resolve. Grief clears the fog from your eyes in strange ways. Sometimes it makes the world blur. Sometimes it sharpens it until everything is painfully, unavoidably clear. And in that moment, what became clear was that my brother's cabin was not property. It was inheritance, not just legally, but emotionally, spiritually. It was the place where his children deserved to grow, to heal, to remember him. Selling it behind their backs would be a violation so profound it felt like a stain that would never wash away. I stepped back from her, physically needing distance from the words she'd spoken. The gulf expanding between us wasn't just emotional. It felt like the beginning of a fracture that would soon reshape everything about our life together. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with a raw, unfiltered anger that burned through the fog of grief like fire through frost. Before I take you further into what unfolded next, and trust me, it only grew more intense from here, I want to pause for a moment. Tell me in the comments below, what would you have done if someone said something like that at your brother's funeral? Your reaction matters because moments like this expose who we are at our core, and I want to know how this moment hits you. The night after the funeral was soaked in silence, the kind that doesn't feel peaceful but oppressive, as though the air itself has weight and memory. I sat alone in the living room with the lights off, staring through the window at the pale reflection of myself against the darkness outside. The world beyond the glass was shrouded in rain, each droplet tracing slow paths down the pane like the ghost of a tear that refused to fall. My wife was upstairs, her footsteps muted but constant, moving about with the restless energy of someone untouched by the emotional gravity of the day. Every creak in the floorboards above me sounded like an echo of what she had said at the funeral, replaying in my mind like an unwanted recording. Let's sell his cabin before his kids find out. The words didn't just linger, they nested, burrowing deep, growing roots that tangled through everything I tried to think about. I couldn't understand how someone could look at tragedy and see opportunity. My brother's death wasn't even a week old, his children's tears not yet dry, and already she was strategizing, planning, scheming beneath the guise of practicality. I wanted to believe it was grief clouding her judgment, that she was speaking out of shock or fear of financial strain. But no, there had been no tremor in her voice, no faltering, just cold, deliberate clarity. That was what chilled me most. It made me question not only her words, but every quiet moment of our marriage, every decision, every choice that once seemed guided by shared values, but now felt like pieces of a puzzle rearranging into a different image altogether. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the window with the rhythm of an anxious heart, and somewhere between those steady drops, I made up my mind. I went to my brother's cabin that same night. The drive was long, cutting through winding country roads lined with skeletal trees swaying in the storm. Headlights carved narrow tunnels through sheets of rain, and the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers was the only sound besides the low hum of the engine and the louder hum of my own thoughts. The farther I drove, the heavier the grief felt, pressing down with each mile until I reached the turnoff, an old dirt path half swallowed by weeds. The tires crunched over gravel, the forest swallowing the car as if guarding the secret at the end of the road. Then, at last, through the curtain of rain, the cabin appeared, rising from the earth like something carved out of memory. The porch light was still out, just as my brother always left it when he wasn't there, and for a fleeting second, I could almost believe I'd see him step out onto that porch, grin wide, holding 2 mugs of coffee, his voice echoing through the night with that familiar warmth that could melt even the coldest silence. But the silence that greeted me now was different. It wasn't empty, it was sacred, untouched, holding its breath as if waiting for me to speak first. When I opened the door, the scent hit me immediately: cedar, smoke, and the faint trace of pine sap. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. His flannel jacket still hung on the hook by the door, his boots neatly lined beneath it. The table bore a few unfinished crossword puzzles, a pen resting diagonally across one of them as though he'd just stepped outside and would be back any minute. My throat tightened until I couldn't breathe. The cabin was alive with his absence. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, tracing my fingers over the rough grain of the wood he had cut himself, remembering the day we first came here as young men. We'd been barely 20, armed with nothing but an old saw, a borrowed truck, and a dream of building something that would last. He was always the builder. I was the talker. He believed in the strength of things made by hand, in the poetry of endurance. Every beam, every nail in this cabin had a story behind it, laughter nailed into the structure along with the metal. The thought of anyone, especially my wife, reducing this to property, made my blood boil. I sat by the fireplace, though I didn't light it. The storm outside grew fierce, the wind pressing against the walls with a mournful moan. I could almost hear my brother's voice in it, soft but steady, reminding me of the promise we once made to each other as kids, that no matter what happened in life, we'd always protect what we built together. And now that promise had fallen to me alone. I realized in that moment of grief-sharpened clarity that my wife's words weren't just cruel. They were a test of who I was when stripped of everything comfortable and familiar. Would I compromise the past for convenience? Would I betray blood for logic? Would I become like her, pragmatic to the point of soullessness? No, I couldn't. I wouldn't. The next morning, I returned home. She was in the kitchen, making coffee, humming to herself as though the world hadn't shifted beneath us. She looked up and smiled, soft, rehearsed, hollow. "Where'd you go?" she asked lightly. I told her the truth. I'd gone to the cabin. I'd signed the documents my brother had left, finalizing his will, and had the property transferred to his children's trust. Her smile faltered. Just slightly, but enough. The air changed. She set her mug down slowly, the ceramic clinking against the counter like a tiny gunshot. "You what?" she said, her tone too calm, too controlled. I repeated myself. It belongs to them now. It always should have. Her silence was a storm of its own. Beneath the surface calm, I could feel the anger tightening. She didn't yell. That wasn't her way. Instead, she turned away, her shoulders stiff, her voice even. "You didn't consult me." The absurdity of that sentence almost made me laugh. Consult her? About my brother's legacy? About the only piece of him left for his kids? Something inside me hardened. "It wasn't yours to consult on," I said, and I think that was the first time I truly meant every word I spoke. Her head turned slightly, eyes sharp, expression unreadable. "You're making decisions you'll regret," she murmured. But I didn't regret it. Not even a little. Days passed in silence between us. Conversations became transactions. Meals became routines performed in separate worlds. I started spending weekends at the cabin, repairing the old dock, fixing the shutters, making it a place of safety again. Sometimes my niece and nephew came with me. They'd help paint, skip stones on the lake, or sit by the fire as I told them stories about their father, stories that painted him as the hero he truly was. They laughed, they cried, and slowly I watched the color return to their faces, the heaviness in their eyes lift bit by bit. It was healing for them. For me, too. But my wife, she couldn't stand it. Every visit, every mention of that cabin became another wedge between us. One night, she finally said what she'd been holding back. "You're wasting your time there. You're clinging to ghosts. You're throwing away what could have been a future for us." I looked at her, really looked, and saw not the woman I had married but a stranger whose definition of future didn't include family, or love, or loyalty. Just accumulation. "You don't understand," I said quietly. "That cabin isn't a burden. It's a heartbeat." The argument that followed was quiet but final, the kind of conversation that doesn't explode, it implodes. Silent pauses heavier than shouts. By the end of it, I realized that the gap between us wasn't born at the funeral. It had been growing for years, invisible until grief shone a harsh light on it. And though I didn't yet know it, that realization was only the beginning of what was coming next. The reckoning, the confrontation, the moment everything we were built on would finally collapse. But before we step into that storm, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, do you think I did the right thing by giving the cabin to his kids, even if it meant breaking my marriage apart? Your thoughts will guide me as I move into the next act, because what comes next changes everything forever. Before I go on, let me remind you. If you've been following this story, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss the end of this journey. Because what happened next didn't just test love and loyalty. It tore open everything I thought I knew about who I was, and who she was, and what it truly means to honor the dead while still living among the living. The day of reckoning came without fanfare. It started as an ordinary Saturday morning, sunlight spilling through the kitchen window like gold over cracked porcelain. I'd just returned from the cabin after another quiet night spent sanding the porch rails, fixing the roof, and making sure the place was ready for the coming winter. I smelled like pine and smoke and a hint of sawdust, the scent of purpose, of work done with love. When I walked in, she was at the table with her laptop open, the glow of the screen reflecting off her face. She didn't look up when I entered, just the soft clicking of keys. I poured myself a coffee, the silence between us thick enough to hear the distant hum of the refrigerator. Then she spoke, her tone flat but precise, the way a surgeon might speak before making an incision. "I've been thinking," she said, "if you're going to keep running back there every weekend, maybe we should consider living separately for a while." I froze mid-sip, the bitterness of coffee suddenly sharp against my tongue. The words weren't shocking. They were inevitable. We'd been drifting apart for months, orbiting different suns, pretending the same house could hold two entirely different worlds. Still, hearing it aloud was like standing on a frozen lake and feeling the ice crack beneath your feet. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly. I expected anger from her, or relief, or some flicker of emotion that would prove there was still something human left between us. But there was nothing. She simply nodded, as though checking off an item from a list. "I'll call a realtor," she said. And that was when I realized she didn't mean separation. She meant liquidation. She was still trying to sell the cabin, not out of grief anymore, not out of practicality, but out of spite. The idea of it burned through me like a fuse sparking toward something explosive. "No," I said, the word steady, firm, final. She looked up, eyes sharp as cut glass. "It's marital property," she said. "It's tied to your name." "Which means—" I cut her off before she could finish. "It's not yours to touch." The silence that followed was thunderous, a storm waiting to break. For a long time, neither of us moved. The world outside was unnervingly still. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Then, softly, she said something I'll never forget. "You care more about a dead man's house than your living wife." It was meant as an accusation. But it landed as truth, not in the way she intended, but in a deeper, more painful way. Because yes, I cared more about that cabin, but not because it was his house. I cared because it was everything we'd ever built that wasn't broken. It was honest. It didn't manipulate or scheme or pretend. It stood through storms and seasons and loss without asking for anything in return. It was real, and maybe that was what terrified her most, that I could find peace and meaning in something she couldn't own or control. The argument that followed wasn't loud. It was cold, surgical, quiet in tone but catastrophic in consequence. She talked about finances, legal rights, shared assets. I talked about family, legacy, loyalty, words that seemed foreign to her. By the end of it, her eyes were dry and mine were not. She walked out without another word. The front door closed with the softest click I've ever heard, almost tender, like an afterthought. But the silence that followed was absolute. Weeks passed, the papers came. Separation agreements, property evaluations, polite legal phrasing that stripped the soul out of everything we had built. I signed them all. The cabin was exempt, safely tucked under the children's trust I had created that night after the funeral, legally untouchable. She didn't fight it. Not because she accepted it, but because she'd already moved on. There was someone else, I later learned, someone who spoke her language of opportunity and ambition. And when I heard it, it didn't hurt. Not in the way betrayal usually does. It was more like a sigh from the universe confirming what I already knew, that our story had simply reached its end long before that funeral. But endings, I've learned, can be gifts. The months that followed were slow and quiet, the kind of quiet that heals rather than haunts. I spent most of my time at the cabin, fixing the things my brother never got around to. The back door hinge, the loose step on the porch, the old window that whistled when the wind hit it just right. His kids came often, their laughter filling the place with a light that felt like resurrection. We'd sit by the fire, roasting marshmallows, and they'd tell me about school, about their dreams, about how sometimes they still talked to their dad when they were alone. I listened. I always listened. The forest outside stood tall and eternal, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel alone. I felt part of something bigger, a continuation, not an ending. One evening, as the sun sank behind the pines, painting the lake gold, my niece asked me quietly, "Uncle, are you sad you lost her?" I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "No," I said softly. "I didn't lose her. I just finally saw her for who she was. And I think she lost herself long before she left me." The little girl nodded as though she understood more than a child should. "Daddy would be proud of you," she said. I turned away so she wouldn't see the tears that welled up. In the months that followed, I rebuilt more than the cabin. I rebuilt myself. The walls grew stronger, the air inside warmer, and the lake, once a mirror for grief, became a reflection of peace. I started a small workshop there, teaching local kids how to build things, simple things, like birdhouses or small stools, but enough to give them the same feeling my brother once gave me. That with your hands and your heart, you can make something that lasts longer than you do. The laughter, the sawdust, the firelight, they all mixed together until the ache inside me transformed into something softer, something almost like gratitude. And yet, every time I stood on that porch, watching the wind ripple the water, I thought about how grief reveals people, how it strips away every mask and leaves only truth behind. Some truths wound, others heal, but all of them shape us. Losing my brother had felt like losing a part of myself, but what I came to understand was that love doesn't die. It just changes form. It lives on in the things we protect, in the choices we make when no one's watching. So yes, maybe I lost my marriage, but I kept my promise. I kept my brother's dream alive. I gave his children something no inheritance could replace: the knowledge that loyalty still exists in a world that too often trades it for convenience. And if you've made it this far with me, if you've felt even a fraction of what I felt, then please subscribe, because stories like this matter. They remind us that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that return us to ourselves. There's a stillness that lives in the woods around the cabin now, a kind of breathing silence that hums like a heartbeat under the soil, alive but gentle. I've grown to love that silence. It isn't emptiness. It's presence. It's memory. It's healing. It's the sound of everything that used to hurt slowly transforming into something that finally makes sense. The cabin has become more than wood and nails. It's a living archive of everything my brother and I were, everything we built, everything we believed in. Sometimes when the morning fog rolls off the lake and curls around the porch like smoke, I swear I can still feel him there. Not as a ghost, not as an ache, but as warmth. The kind that never fades no matter how many winters come. The kids visit often. They're growing fast now, voices deeper, steps surer, eyes brighter. They've started calling it their cabin, and hearing those words fills me with something that's both peace and pride. They've painted the old dock blue, rebuilt the fire pit, and left handprints in the cement step by the porch. Every mark they make becomes another layer of legacy, another heartbeat added to the rhythm of this place. When I watch them, I see echoes of my brother. The way his son squints at the horizon before skipping a stone. The way his daughter hums quietly while stacking kindling. I see that spark he left behind, the one that refuses to die, and I realize that everything I fought to protect was never about property. It was about continuity, about love that doesn't need words to survive. As for my wife, or ex-wife I should say, I heard she moved to the city, started a new life surrounded by glass towers and endless noise. I wish her well, truly. I don't hate her. There was a time when I thought I might, when the bitterness threatened to swallow me whole. But hate is heavy, and grief taught me enough about weight. She made her choices, and I made mine. The difference is that I chose to stay close to what mattered, to the soil, to memory, to the pulse of something honest. I hope one day she finds a silence that comforts her the way this one comforts me. Life at the cabin has become a rhythm of simple things: splitting wood, tending the garden, teaching the kids how to build small boats out of scrap planks, fixing what needs fixing, and leaving the rest to nature. I've learned that peace doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, like light through the cracks of a closed door, until one day you realize it's everywhere. I still talk to my brother sometimes, out loud even. When the stars come out and the lake reflects them like scattered diamonds, I sit on the porch and tell him about the kids, about the world, about how his cabin still stands strong. And sometimes, when the fire pops just right, or the wind sighs through the trees, I imagine I hear him answer back. Not with words, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing his story didn't end with his death. It simply changed narrators. I've also come to see that loss isn't the opposite of love. It's its echo. You only grieve because you cared deeply, and that grief, if you let it, eventually becomes gratitude. Gratitude for the time you had, for the memories you can still touch, for the lessons that pain leaves behind. My brother's passing shattered me. Yes, but it also stripped away everything false. It showed me what remains when the world takes everything else: integrity, loyalty, and the ability to stand firm in the storm. I sometimes take letters up to the ridge, the same place we used to sit as kids, overlooking the lake. I leave them under a flat stone, a small ritual that's become sacred to me. They're not always about him. Sometimes they're about me. About learning to forgive. About finding beauty in solitude. About understanding that endings aren't punishments, but transitions. From noise to silence. From pain to peace. From one kind of love to another. The last time I was up there, the sky burned with the colors of late autumn, crimson, gold, and a strange violet that bled into the lake below. I stood there, wind tugging at my coat, and realized I wasn't sad anymore. Not really. The ache had turned to something softer, like nostalgia mixed with calm. I thought about all the things that had happened: the funeral, her words, the arguments, the rebuilding. And for the first time, I didn't see tragedy. I saw a path. A difficult one, yes, but one that had led me here, to truth, to purpose, to peace. If I've learned anything through all of this, it's that grief doesn't erase us, it reveals us. And love, real love, isn't about possession or permanence. It's about stewardship. It's about taking care of what's fragile, of holding space for someone else's memory so that it can keep breathing long after they're gone. That's what I did. That's what this cabin is. A promise kept. A love made visible. And as I write this now, sitting by the fireplace that crackles with familiar warmth, I can hear the faint laughter of the kids outside, the splash of stones skipping across the lake, the soft hum of the forest settling into evening. It's all so alive, so present, so full of quiet meaning. I close my eyes and let it wash over me, the way sunlight filters through pine branches, soft and golden. And for the first time since that cold gray morning at the funeral, I feel completely, undeniably free. If this story reached you, if it stirred something inside you, reminded you of someone you've loved, or made you think about what really matters, then please like this story and subscribe. Not for me, but so we can keep telling stories that remind us of what it means to be human. Stories about loyalty, loss, and the kind of love that doesn't fade, even after goodbye. Because sometimes, the hardest endings are just beginnings in disguise. And sometimes, peace isn't found in moving on. It's found in staying, in honoring, in keeping the light burning a little longer for those who can't. And so the fire burns, the lake gleams, and the cabin stands, strong, timeless, and full of love. The end.